Hello and welcome. In this video, we'll discuss the evaluation and eligibility portions of the Individuals with Disabilities Act, Part B. So the initial request for an evaluation can come from a variety of sources. It could come directly from the parent if they're concerned with their child's participation and performance at school and suspect that their child may have a disability, or sometimes it comes after a child is diagnosed with a disability from outside sources and the parent is seeking services and supports in the schools. The request could also come from a state or local educational agency, or in other words, the school, or another state agency. There may be a variety of reasons a school wants to complete an evaluation. Sometimes it comes from a teacher who may have observed some difficulties in the classroom, or it could come following district or statewide assessments if the child scores low enough. In any case, after obtaining parental consent to evaluate, the school has 60 days, unless otherwise specified by the state, to complete the full evaluation to determine the needs of the child, as well as if they actually have a disability. However, the school is not responsible for failure to complete that evaluation in the designated timeframe if the parent repeatedly fails or refuses to produce the child for evaluation. So we know that children with disabilities sometimes have a lot of health needs as well, and that's okay. It just is something to note here that if the child isn't available for evaluation, then the school is not held to that 60-day time period. Now we'll talk about parental consent. Before beginning the evaluation process, the requesting agency needs to obtain parental consent. Though it's important to note here that under the law, a screening is not considered an evaluation and it doesn't require parental consent. For example, if a teacher or specialist wanted to do a simple screening to determine instructional strategies that may be effective for curriculum implementation, they wouldn't necessarily need to get parental consent for that. Another important point here is that consent for evaluation is not, excuse me, automatic consent for special education or services under IDEA. Parental consent has to be obtained again before services actually begin. In the event that a parent either refuses to give consent or fails to respond to requests for evaluations or to provide services, the school is no longer responsible for ensuring FAPE or free appropriate public education, and they're not held to developing an IEP or hosting that IEP meeting. For children who are wards of the state, it's a little bit different. The school has to make a reasonable effort to obtain parental consent, but if they can't locate the parents, or if parental rights have been terminated or transferred by the courts and the transferee has given consent, then parental consent is not required. This is another area of the law that's a little bit vague and doesn't clearly define what constitutes reasonable effort. According to IDEA, the local educational agency, teacher, or parents can make that initial request and the request for a reevaluation if they feel that the child's education or related service needs have changed. So this includes if the child has made strides beyond their goals. So improvement is very important here as well. We always want to make sure that we're meeting the child where they're at and supporting them in the most effective ways to maximize their outcomes. The law dictates that reevaluation have to occur at least every 3 years and no more than once a year, unless the parent and local educational agency agree otherwise. The law also states that the IEP team has to try to obtain parental consent prior to initiating required reevaluations, but if the parents don't respond to reasonable measures, there's that term again, then they can begin. So it's a little different with the reevaluation. Understand that your consent as a parent is not required, and it doesn't really delve into why. But if you think about it at this point, if the child has an IEP already, you've already consented to evaluations and to the IEP, meaning that you kind of want supports and services for your child. So it's a little bit more inherent than it is with that initial request. So now getting into evaluation procedures. IDEA goes on to break down appropriate evaluation measures, beginning with a statement that the schools must use a variety of assessment tools and strategies that are technically sound to determine if the child has a disability and to determine the appropriate content of the child's IEP. The I in IEP stands for individualized, so it makes sense then that the school needs to have a variety of assessments available to target each child's unique needs. The law goes on to say that the evaluation materials must not be discriminatory on a racial or cultural basis. They need to be valid and reliable and administered by by a qualified professional. A lot of standardized assessments do require training, and some of them even require certification. So just be aware of that. The law says that they should be administered in the language and form most likely to yield the most accurate information on what the child knows. This piece helps to ensure that the team is evaluating a true disability and not that the child didn't understand the questions because of something like a language barrier. IDEA also specifically states that a child must be assessed in all areas of suspected disability. A lot of times it can be difficult to decipher why the child is struggling academically. It may be one thing, but oftentimes it's a combination of hurdles. So it's really important to complete a comprehensive evaluation so that the child gets all of their needs met. IDEA states that the IEP team needs to review all existing evaluations. This could include any information that was provided by parents, any assessments that the student has taken. A lot of times, kiddos will be receiving services, private services outside of the school setting, and they oftentimes do their own evaluations and things like that. And sometimes that information can be very helpful to the school team as well. Should, excuse me, also include any observations by teachers and related service providers for initial and reevaluations. So the team's going to use all of this information to determine eligibility, understand the child's unique needs, and to create or adjust the child's IEP as. So along with that, parents have the right to request further assessment as appropriate because again, the school is required by law to investigate all areas of suspected disability. IDEA also states that the school needs to inform parents of this right. So I'm telling you now, the school should let you know as well. The law doesn't specifically delineate how the schools have to inform parents. A lot of schools will give information packets to parents at the beginning of the process or before the IEP meeting. Everyone's busy and people often don't take time to read through the documents they're given. They can be very, very dense, but a lot of times that's where parent rights like this one is going to be listed. So if you are a parent with a child with a disability, I encourage you to find the time to thoroughly read everything that the school gives you so that you are best equipped to advocate for your child. So now we'll talk about determining eligibility. So IDEA does have a section that gives a little more detail about the eligibility piece. It restates that eligibility is ultimately determined by the IEP team and also specifies that a copy of the evaluation must be given to parents. It specifies that a lack of proper instruction and a lack of English proficiency don't qualify the student as a student with a disability. So again, we need to make sure we're teasing out the appropriate parts here. This is why it's so important that assessments are given in a familiar language and in ways that are going to provide the most accurate information about the child's knowledge and abilities. This section also requires a full reevaluation to determine that a child no longer has a disability. So saying that a child has a disability is a big deal, but wanting to remove that status is an even bigger deal. And that's because we want to make sure that we're not taking away supports and services for children who need them to really thrive and be successful. Now, if the child graduated from secondary school with a regular diploma, or if they exceed the age of eligibility for FAPE, then an evaluation doesn't have to occur. But at that point, the school is required by law to provide a summary of the child's academic performance, as well as their functional performance. The law requires that this summary includes recommendations on assisting the child with their post secondary goal. So, again, that goes into that transition piece of it as well. So, that concludes our talk on eligibility and evaluation. Please join me for the next video as we continue working through IDEA Part B. Thank you.